Hi everyone, thank you for clicking on the video, and today I'm going to be sharing with you part of my movie collection, and it's going to be about the Matrix franchise on 4K Blu-ray. Now, I'm not particularly experienced with reviewing discs and whatnot, as I don't really have any professional technology. The stuff that I really work with is just my TV, which is 50 inches, and I think it's I don't remember if it's a Sony or a Samsung soundbar and subwoofer, but generally when I watch 4K Blu-rays, especially these ones, I like to listen to them on full blast, so that way I can hear all the audio. And I know my TV is not particularly that big to notice all the minute details and improvements on the 4K Blu-ray as if I were to have maybe a 70-inch TV or a projector. But yeah, I know a lot of people usually have about 55 inches when they buy their TVs. Now, what I'm going to be talking about today is not a review of the movies, but I'm just going to be talking about the product themselves. The discs, the packaging, maybe some fun facts here and there. But it's not going to be a review of the movies, but however, I probably will give my thoughts on some of the movies after the initial thoughts of these discs. Now we're going to be covering these movies in order. So first one up is going to be The Matrix, first released in theaters in 1999. And I just want to say that when I heard that these were being released in 4K, I was so excited to grab these movies. I remember having the first Matrix on DVD, but I didn't own the second one, but I did own the third one also on DVD. One thing that I really like about the packaging on the Matrix trilogy is that the cover on this is actually different from the cover of the box. So I actually always found that's pretty neat, because it's always nice to have a slip cover for your movie, but it's doubly nice when you have a slip cover that's different from the box cover. So unfortunately though, for people who like slip covers, if you didn't grab this movie during its first initial batches, you probably missed out on the slip cover, although I have seen some here and there that they do have the slip cover, but for the most part now when I see them, they're just by themselves. So myself, I actually always like to collect the movies with the slipcover, and especially if they have different artworks, then I have to get it, because otherwise that just does not work for me. Unfortunately, one of the things that I don't like about the packaging is actually that both on the slipcover and on the box, it has this HDR logo on here. I mean, I get it, you want to let your customers know that the movie's going to be in HDR, but I mean, couldn't they just make this a sticker? And did they really have to put this on here too? Because it's intrusive now in here. It reminds me of, no offense to anybody in the UK, but I know the UK, they have their ratings right under here, and I know some of them, they actually have for certain releases better covers than here in the US where I live, but it's just those tiny little logos that I'm like, oh, it's intruding on the artwork, and I don't like that. So as much as I love this artwork, I don't like this, but it doesn't irritate me as much as boxes that say like a Rotten Tomato thing that's actually printed on there. Now, as far as the image quality on the 4K, it's actually a really good transfer. It's not necessarily reference material. As I said, I watch all my stuff on a 50-inch, but I don't need a reference material since I have a 50-inch. It really covers up the parts that are not as sharp or as good as other parts of the movie. But even if I did have a bigger TV, like a 75-inch, then I wouldn't necessarily mind that this isn't reference quality, because it's still a really, really good 4K transfer, especially a movie coming from 1999. So they scanned the negative again, and then it got remastered into its 4K. One thing that's particularly different about this movie in comparison to it when it was released on DVD and Blu-ray, but I don't know about VHS because I never saw the movie on VHS, is that the original green tint that was there, that the heavy green tint, is gone. Now, I read on forums that how this movie looks now on 4K was actually how the movie looked like in theaters when it was released, the original color timing. So as I said, I watched this movie in theaters, but I don't remember the colors that it was, because for the longest time when this movie was out, it's like everybody just came to know the first Matrix with the green tint. So now that the green tint is gone, I can't really attest to whether this is the original color timing from when it was released back in theaters, or if the original was actually that green tint that was on the DVD and the Blu-ray, and then was later changed to match its two sequels. Now, as far as audio goes, I know that a lot of 4Ks are now being released in Dolby Atmos. So I don't have a Dolby Atmos setup, unfortunately, but maybe one day. So in the meantime, I just blasted my soundbar and my subwoofer, and even with that, I can still hear like everything in great detail. I remember the audio still being really, really good. Like in the subway scene when Neo and Smith, they start to fight, they grab and start blasting at each other, and during that slow motion part, you can hear the actual difference in the bullets, and like how that's brought more forward than the rest of the audio from the scene. Another thing to note that is that the Blu-ray that comes in here is the master of the 4K. So if you still wanted to watch that green tint, unfortunately you're not going to get it with this Blu-ray, so you would probably have to track down an older version of the Matrix. But I always see the older steelbooks of the first Matrix like in Best Buy, so it's not very hard to find if you want to still prefer the green tint rather than this new color timing of it. Next up is The Matrix Reloaded, released back in 2003. So this one also has two different images. First, it's the images of the trio right here, and then there's another one here of the keys from the keymaker. And I think that all the images that they picked for each movie, and I mean these ones, they all fit their movies pretty well, so I really like that. Again, this has the HDR thing on both of them, which I don't like, as I said. Again, this was a really good 4K transfer, but just to be aware that the trilogy is not reference material when it comes to image, but it doesn't need to be, because it's still a great image in comparison to many releases of the 4K. So I just want to say it's probably a notch or two under reference material, but also I have a 50-inch, so it doesn't really matter to me that if it's reference material or not, because I don't have the necessary equipment to fully enjoy a reference material disc. But even if I did, I would still very much enjoy this movie. And again, the audio is really good, especially during the big rave scene. You can hear all the beats. It sounds like a rave is going on in the room that you're watching it in. If you have, I imagine that if you had the Dolby Atmos setup, that you could just start raving along with the people in the movie. Now, as far as I know, I believe that also the Blu-rays for The Matrix Reloaded and The Matrix Revolutions are new Blu-rays that come from the 4K master, just in 1080p. I don't believe that the older Blu-rays, even though the colors aren't going to be that different, but usually if they've remastered the movie, like this in 4K, and went through the effort of the first one to change it on the Blu-ray, then I imagine that in this one and in Revolutions, the Blu-rays are also the new masters. But because I watch these movies in 4K, I haven't really gone through and watched these movies in Blu-ray. And now for the third one, The Matrix Revolutions. Now, actually, this one is my favorite movie out of the trilogy. And again, this one has the trio yet again, but this time this one has the Sentinels. I think it fits that the Sentinel is in The Matrix Revolutions rather than in the first one, because in this movie there's the big war with the Sentinels, and they are really terrifying. So like, if you thought that the Sentinels were scary in the first movie, during the war scene when they're just like grabbing people and impaling them, it's just like, holy crap, they're a lot bigger than you would think so, like in The Matrix Reloaded, because you don't really see them with people. But in Revolutions, you see them in the war, so it's just like, wow, they're actually pretty terrifying. Unfortunately, one of the things that I really dislike that makes the trilogy just that little bit of like, it's so close to being a 10 out of 10 for me in terms of packaging, is these images are reversed. So The Matrix Revolutions is actually supposed to be the cover for The Matrix Reloaded, and this is supposed to be the cover for The Matrix Revolutions. Now, I don't know who really made, or who made the decision to, you know, have these images in the movies that they were, but the reason why I know they're supposed to be like that is because in this one, The Matrix Revolutions, Morpheus doesn't have the sword. He has this in Reloaded. And also this image of Morpheus having this gun was actually in The Matrix Revolutions DVD, and in the movie he carries this gun. So it's like these are supposed to be switched. So that's really one thing that irks me about this packaging. If there was ever like a re-release of like these two, where these two images were switched out with their proper titles, then I would probably double dip just to get those slipcovers, honestly. And again, the image quality for Revolutions is great. The parts that I absolutely noticed when I first watched this 4K was the battle over in Zion, where you just see like lightning flashing by, the sparks of all the bullets, and especially near the end of the battle when it's just like reds and fire, and it's like, oh my gosh, all the colors and the contrast, everything just works so well together, and I appreciate it a lot more than I did my DVD. And I watched that DVD so much, so when I saw this in 4K, I was so happy that, you know, that I was able to see it again, to see it like that again, just like almost how I watched it in theaters when it was released, you know, also released in 2003, the same year. And of course, the big superhero fight before superheroes movies actually really took off, you know, at the end of this movie was amazing. In this, it's like, oh, you could see all the rain pours, and it's like just the detail and the contrast in Neo's outfit, and you know, even there during with the Dolby Atmos mix, their dialogue, it was actually, it was mixed really well, because I was able to make out what, like, clearly what they were saying, and still hear all the raindrops and the ambiance in the background. And the Neo Damarong track, I was like, oh my gosh, I love that track so much. I sometimes listen to it when I drive. So, you know, of the 3 discs, this is my favorite one, just because it's the one that I enjoy the most and the one that I get the most out of. Between these 3, they were all shot on film, so they're all gonna have like that little tinge of film, which I personally like, that the grain. I think it like really adds to it, because, you know, if you remove the grain from a movie that was shot on film, you lose detail. I mean, you can obviously, you know, sharpen it and so on and so forth, but it's not the same, because then you're making up for detail that was already lost. So it's like redrawing over something that was erased. It's not the same thing. And finally, we come to the most recent release, The Matrix Resurrections, which was released in December 2021. So back when this movie was announced, I was super excited that this movie that it was announced. And when I first saw the teaser trailer, I jumped out of my seat when I heard that White Rabbit was playing for this, because it was like, oh my gosh, all the callbacks to the first movie, and I really liked that song, and then it just fits so well with the Matrix Resurrections and all that. It was great. Now, the thing about the packaging that unfortunately is different from these two is that it does not follow the same image structure. So even though this is somewhat uniform with the others, the image on this is the same. So even if you don't get this with the slipcover, you're not going to be really missing out on the image of this. But one thing that I will say that runs across all the Matrix movies is that this little part that comes in the slipcover, all of them, they don't have this part right here. So it's actually, for all of them, it's a nice, just clean image of this when it doesn't have the slipcover, which at first is a little jarring, but it's like, I really appreciate just having the image and not anything obscuring it. And this one also does not have the HDR on any part of this, so it's just the image. So on that part, it's a plus. So the spine on this is actually white this time around, or sort of white, which is different from the trilogy, because the trilogy has it in black. But I think it like, for the purposes of this movie, it suits it fine. But if you wanted a uniform look, it's semi-uniform when this one comes in, because it's not the same. But, you know, considering what this movie is, I'm fine with it not being exactly uniform, because it's uniform enough that it still fits in there and still fits, you know, about what this movie is, and all this similar but different yet same but not, that type of thing. Now, unlike those 3 movies, this one from reviews that I've heard is actually supposed to be a reference quality disc. I remember when I watched it in theaters, I was really blown away by the cinematography and all the detail that was in there. Unlike the other 3, this one was shot in digital and not film, so this one is going to have a very, very clean look, which I noticed right off the bat when the trailer was first shown. And I know some people aren't gonna like that. Some people prefer the look of the trilogy because those were shot on film and this was shot on digital. But again, because of what this movie is and with all its context, is like, I think it fits it really well. But I'll talk about that once I get to my personal thoughts on the movies. Now, the audio, back when I listened to this in theaters, it was really good, but I know around near the end of the climax, it started to get a bit muddied. I'm not sure if it's the same thing with this one, or maybe it was just the theater room that I saw it in, but, I'm hoping that it wasn't too bad. It was you can still hear everything, but you can tell that it wasn't as clean as some parts earlier in the movies. But I know that's some movies, when they get released in theaters, they're not entirely finished, so they just release with the best of what they can do, and then they try to fix it later on in the physical releases. So it might be that case. So I've not yet seen this movie at home, but but from what I've heard of it, this being a reference material, I bet it's going to look amazing on my 50-inch TV. And I know 50 inches isn't really that big of a TV, but I think it's enough to enjoy a 4K movie, and other movies such as Blu-ray when some of those movies don't get released for 4K. So for me, it's a good middle ground. And then eventually, once I get a bigger TV, then I'll be able to enjoy this movie to its fullest, and hopefully later on a sound system, a proper one. Now, in terms of packaging for these 4 movies, I think that this is an amazing packaging, like when compares to like other franchises, just because the newest release actually looks semi-uniform to its original releases, or not original releases, to its re-releases of these, which is not something that you got with Mission Impossible and other re-releases that got the 4K transfer, and then the new movie got its new cover and then it didn't fit in uniform. So I was very happy that these did. And I'm really happy that the original trilogy were not modified in terms of having DNR in their movies to make it look like Resurrections, because the trilogy is supposed to look like its own thing because it was shot on film and that's where all the detail is. And then Resurrections was shot on digital because that's how movies are shot nowadays. And digital fits with how Resurrection is. So I'm very happy that it didn't go the route of Lord of the Rings. So in terms of just discs and the packaging, I give it like really, really top notch. It's one of my favorite things that I've ever collected. Okay, so now I'm going to go into a little bit of my thoughts about these movies. They're not going to be too long, but one thing that I thought about The Matrix once this 4K came out was that, again, I don't know if the green tint was actually original when it was released in theaters, or if this is how it was looked like when it released in theaters, but I imagine that the green tint does add something to this movie when you watch it in the older formats, especially like if you were to watch it in VHS. I imagine that the VHS also has a green tint, but I'm not sure. And then when you watch this with its new colors, then it's almost like a different experience, but not entirely. It's like the green is still there, it's just more muted. So it would be cool to go to see this movie again in its older formats and then compare it to the 4K, because I imagine that for this first Matrix, unlike other movies when they re-release, then not a lot of people want their older releases anymore. But with this one, I imagine that its older releases are still going to have a place in terms of collecting, just because watching it with that green tint is a different experience than watching it with its new one. And I'm not going to say which is better and which is not, because personally I actually prefer this one, but I know a lot of people prefer the green tint because for so many years we've had that green tint. But it's just, I guess, up to your preference on which one you like. But I'm really happy that at least this one, and there's plenty of copies of the first Matrix with that green tint. I will say that in an unfortunate negative with the packaging, if you didn't get these movies with the slipcovers, you can always get them in either in the 3-box trilogy collection or in the 4-box collection. But in either collection, they don't come with the slipcovers. It's just the movies without the slipcovers. So if you get the trilogy, then sure, it's fine because the 3 movies still look uniform in their look. But if you got the 4, then it's like you get those 3 movies and then you get just the cover of The Matrix Revolutions. And to me, that I don't like that at all, when just because the slipcovers are different images and the trilogy has its own images and then Resurrections has the same image, then at that point it's not uniform enough for me to really like that. And of course, the images of the front with the slipcovers I think are still really good images, even if we didn't get 2 different ones. If we just got the one as the slipcover image, then I would have still been happy with that. So unfortunately, if slipcovers matters to you, then those boxes are not going to be as nice of packaging as if you got them individual. But if you get them individual, it's more expensive than if you get them in the packages. But that's just the curse of collection. So if some of you didn't know, The Matrix Reloaded and The Matrix Revolutions were actually shot back to back. So after the first movie was done, these 2 were shot at the same time, which is why they released in the same year. So they didn't shoot one and then shoot the other and then so on and so forth, which is the same, which I know some movies like Lord of the Rings and Hunger Games, they shot their movies back to back. Well, I think Hunger Games shot their movies back to back. I don't really remember. Another thing about The Matrix Reloaded when it comes to 4K, the big Burly Brawl fight, even though it is really clear, you can clear it. It just makes the CGI look a bit more goofy during that fight, and it is like whiplash when it goes to CGI part of the fight and then back into the actual actors in the scene. And it's just like, oh right, this looks so totally different. I mean, it still has its own charm, but it's like technology. So of the 3 movies, I think Reloaded is probably my least favorite. Because of the 3, it's the one that I remember the least about, which I remember all of the movies and everything that happens in them, but like of those little minute details, probably this one is some of the least that I remember, just because this is very much like a part 1 to a part 2, because all the setup and everything happens in this movie, and all the climax happens in Revolutions. So Revolutions, there is nothing of setup or anything. Everything has all been done in Reloaded. So Revolutions is all entirely the tying up the loose ends, all the climax and everything. So this is like very much the end of the 2-part of the film. But that doesn't make Reloaded any less enjoyable. I still enjoy Reloaded, but it's like if I watch Reloaded, then I have to watch Revolutions, because otherwise Reloaded feels incomplete. Very much like a part 1 to a part 2. Even the movie ends as a to be continued. Which is not a feeling that you get with the first movie, because the first movie was actually just done as a standalone, and then after it made a ton of money, they were greenlit to have the other 2 movies. And the reason why this movie is my favorite is because, as I just said, this movie has all the climax in it. So it's just like, oh, you get all that catharsis. You finally get the Battle of Zion. You get the big fight with Smith. You get them finally going and seeing the Machine City, and you get the big emotional impact with the relationship of Neo and Trinity. That's why Revolution is still my favorite of the 3. It's just really surprising that we got Resurrections at all, because I know the internet back when these movies were released, they really did not like the 2 sequels. They thought it was terrible. They thought it's like, oh, they should have just left the first Matrix alone, because even though the first movie was hype, I think because of how it went in the way of Revolutions, a lot of people dismissed Reloaded and Revolutions together, because it's like, as obviously the first one was meant to be a standalone, so it's the most tidying up, but just people didn't like the sequels, which of course I get. I mean, I obviously see the flaws in the movies, but then after learning more about the directors, the process, and the intent of what everything was in the duology, I really appreciate Reloaded and Revolutions a whole lot more than I did when I was younger. Then once having all of that in mind, the three movies actually work really, really well together. But you kind of have to invest some of your time to like really digest what Reloaded and Revolutions are because of those three movies. The first one is the easiest to watch, and there's nothing wrong with having a formula and a twist in the formula. But I think that the second and the third one went just a little bit more too out of the box for people's comfort. So, which is why people don't like two and three, even though aside from its presentation, because presentation is what really matters when you're presenting something that is good or something that is bad. The presentation is what affects your enjoyment of it. And just on a surface level, I really like it, and then on the deeper level, I didn't get it, or I thought it was dumb. But then eventually, once I got to learn about it, then I thought that it was really good. It's just that it fumbled on the presentation, and that's why I think people didn't like the sequels. So when I went to go see Resurrections, I was actually really happy that, which I know this is actually a big point of contention, that this movie does not look like the trilogy, because one thing that people forget is that at the end of Revolutions, the Matrix was rebooted, so it doesn't look like how it did for most of that movie and the other two movies, because that was, as far as we know, the seventh iteration of the Matrix, and then by the end of Revolution, this was the eighth. And even in the final last scene, you see color being introduced into the Matrix because it's been rebooted. It is a brighter future. Things are going to change. So that's, I think, one of the reasons people did not like the look of this movie was because it did not look like the original Matrix, but that is the point. This is not the original Matrix. This is a different Matrix. It's not even the eighth version of the Matrix. This is a different version, and I don't think it's the ninth. I think it's like much further on because within the movie they do say that there have been other iterations of the Matrix even after Revolutions, because yeah, I don't want to spoil all of that, but yeah. So having Resurrections look how it does, especially like finally adding color to everything. And I know people don't like the look of it just because everything looks too pop, everything looks too clean, everything looks kind of fake. But but when I saw it, I thought that was sort of the point because this is the Matrix. It's fake. It's not real. And it kind of went into, even though Revolutions kind of ended the Matrix in a way of like everything is going to get better because of the context of Resurrections. Again, I don't want to spoil too much about it, but just having everything look as it is, it's kind of almost like when you chase the dragon, it's like everything, it looks so good, everything feels so good, but then as you get stuck in it, it's kind of just like suffering then ensues. And I just personally like finally there being color in the Matrix. It did take a while to get used to color, and the movie is actually very, very meta. They mention Warner Brothers, they mention the Matrix and the fans and all this and stuff, and I know a lot of people that rubs them the wrong way, but again, because I know of the directors and I know of the actors and like what went on sort of like from what was revealed of who was involved, who was not, and how the movie was written and how it flows. It's not supposed to be like some woke stuff or following a trend. It's like the meta-ness and the things that people don't like about some of the current movies has a point in this movie. But again, just like probably the Reloaded and Revolutions, I think it's a presentation that people didn't like about it. It's probably why it's like, oh, they didn't like bugs, they didn't like the color, they didn't like the new Morpheus. It's just a bunch of things that had they been presented a little bit better, then I think it would have been more accepted. But even as it is, I think it's still a really good movie. I still like it better. I like that one still better than Reloaded. Again, of the four, I think Reloaded is my least favorite just because it feels like a part one, and I have to watch Revolutions to feel like I completed the story. But Resurrections is also like the first one, where they made where it's like the story is about this one particular thing, and then once it ends, it's like the movie's there. It doesn't need sequels, which most likely we're not going to get sequels, even though I kind of want another trilogy with this, but it did make a lot of money in the box office, and unfortunately this is probably the last Matrix movie that we're gonna get for some time unless it gets rebooted. But there was this whole thing with the Wachowskis having control of it, so I don't know if it is gonna get rebooted. Ha ha ha. And again, given with the new characters in the movie, I actually really like Bugs. Morpheus, given to what I know what happens to him in the extended lore, I accept that this Morpheus is not supposed to be Lawrence Fishburne Morpheus. This is a different Morpheus because, again, out of the context of this movie, the way how that happens, he's not going to be the same because this Morpheus did not go through the same things that original Morpheus went through. So, you know, I accept this Morpheus. It just took a little bit of time. The one that was really the hardest to digest is Smith, because Smith comes back in this movie. I'm not going to say how it happens. It's a little bit of public knowledge that Hugo Weaving was asked to come back, but because of scheduling conflicts, he couldn't come back. So, you know, Smith appears, but it's not Hugo Weaving because, you know, he couldn't come to shoot the movie. How they deal with Smith in this movie, I'm not particularly too much of a fan. I actually kind of think Smith shouldn't have been in this movie. It should have been something else, which almost feels like something else, and it kind of feels like they forced the Smith a little bit. But, you know, I sort of accept it, but it's like one of those harder pills to swallow just because Hugo Weaving was so good as Smith, and then the way how, again, the presentation, I get what they were trying to do with Smith, but because of the presentation, this is one of those things that's actually kind of hard to accept. The movie is the longest of all the Matrix movies, and personal thing, I feel like every act kind of feels like the trilogy if it was put into one movie. The first act is very mystery and all that, just like the first one. The second act is all the setup that's going to happen, and then the third act is, you know, all the catharsis, everything finally tying up and resolving. So if you want to watch the trilogy on speed, there you go, watch Matrix Resurrections. I really enjoyed the movie, so as soon as it came out, I went to go and I just bought the movie. So if you want to update your Matrix collection, then I would recommend, you know, you get this collection. But unfortunately, if you're a slipcover fan, you might be a little bit hard-pressed to find these movies with the slipcover. So yeah, that's my discussion about the Matrix franchise in 4K Blu-ray. It's a franchise that I really enjoy, so I grew up with this franchise. Unfortunately, the Animatrix is not getting a 4K release, and it would have been nice to at least get another Blu-ray re-release because it's actually a little bit difficult to get that movie in Blu-ray now, unless you buy it like from the secondhand market. Thank you very much for watching my video. I'm hoping that this was at least entertaining for you to watch. I'm actually going to be talking about all of my physical media collection that I have right here. Most of that is 4K. Some of it is in Blu-ray. I'll be talking about other franchises that I have and other standalones and whatnot. But it's just something that I particularly like talking about, you know, again, with all the, like what goes on with the discs, how is the packaging, and all the, and just a few tidbits of the movie itself, not necessarily review, just things of why I like the movie and why I bought it. So I hope you enjoyed this video about me talking about the Matrix franchise. The next video that I'm going to be making regarding my collection is not going to be another franchise, but more so a director and some of the movies that I have of him in 4K. So I hope you'll come back for that. Thank you very much for watching.